Quiddigitus alumni. Oh, come on. I just started this video. Really? Fine. Don't worry. We're halfway through these videos. This is number 4 of 20. So, for August. Whoa! Alright. This will be fun. For this video, though, it's going to be following many of my interests. So, I've had to cut lots of stuff. Right, we're going to look at the Mediterranean European world up until about 1200, or really stopping at about 1000. So what we're looking here as the big picture, what are the lessons learned from these empires? And there might be some details, but these details are all here to illustrate a bigger point. Now, in all of that, though, before we start anything else, some of these things are going to challenge what you already know or your preconceived notions of them. You've seen about Rome, but we've got to understand there's some other things going on that isn't exactly what we've always been taught. One example is the Roman Republic as this paragon of representative government, when in fact it was one of the major weaknesses to its whole system. And what I mean by that is it failed. How bad did it fail? Well, 2 separate armies and people marched on the Rome itself in conflict. And there were 3 civil wars before it was all said and done. So yeah. Secondly, the senators that represented the people, they were only from the wealthiest families, and it was only 50 to 56 senators that ruled from Rome the entire empire. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start a little bit further back. So we'll start quick history of the Mediterranean world and Europe. While there have been people in Europe for at least tens of thousands of years, we know this from cave paintings, from archaeological evidence. The first part to really start is 1200 BCE. And with that, we have the first proto-empires, the Mycenaean, Minoan, the Hittite, Egyptian civilizations, and all of them collapse at 1200 BCE. It's called the Bronze Age collapse. And really, all the empires fell to this group known only as the Sea Peoples. So after some rebuilding, like 400 years, we finally see new settlements that begin to grow and expand into the Mediterranean, particularly from 2 spots, in the Levant, which is Eastern Mediterranean in Asia, and the Aegean Sea, particularly in Greece. With the Persian invasions ending around 479 BCE, the Greeks enjoyed a relative peace, and at least from foreign invaders, because by 435 BCE, the Greek city-states were fighting themselves. Being that they are all different city-states, this wasn't quite a civil war within one empire, but it was a bunch of different Greek city-states fighting each other, called the Peloponnesian War. And it pitted Athens and its trading empire and colonies against Sparta and most of the other city-states. They all resented the Athenians and their wealth. So let me go into more detail, because that's going to be fun, right? All right, so after the retreat of the Persians, the Aegean Sea...
Get on with it! Yes, get on with it!
All right, 2 real quick things, sorry. If you ever study modern history, political relations, the Cold War, or just how states work together or work against one another, the Peloponnesian War has all of this. In terms of its battles and conflicts and everything, for 30 years, there were Cold Wars, there were rivalries, religions that get intertangled and whatnot. So that's pretty much the first big deal about the Peloponnesian War. The second, though, is it weakens all of these city-states from an outside invader. Here we go with that theme again, right? So this time, though, much of that threat comes from the north. Not the Canadians. Alexander the Great will inherit pretty much a unified Greece under his father Philip II, and will then go into invading the rest of Persia in an all-out campaign that will completely take all of Persia. He goes all the way down to Egypt and finally all the way to the Indus River. Now, the big deal with Alexander is his influence. The influence of Alexander the Great far outlived him. The man was only fighting for 10 years. And he got to the very end and his men were like, please, no more. We want to go home. And he's like, dudes, we got to keep conquering. There's like people over there. And they are like, no way. So anyway, he dies in Babylon in 323 BCE. Whether it's murdered by poison or an infection, he has a demise. And it splits his empire to his 3 generals. More notably, he spread Greek culture and cities. He built 15 Alexandrias, the most famous one being the one in Egypt, and was home to the Great Library. Never forget. Still hurts. Ugh. Worse.
Still have to take the Hippocratic Oath, named after Hippocrates. And he's not the only Greek who gave his name to things. There was also Alexander the Great, a great military leader who conquered countries and founded cities.
So, what shall we call this new city, O Alexander? Oh, sorry. O Alexander the Great.
Yeah. I think we should call it Alexandria, after our great and powerful leader. Where is he? Where is he? Where is he? There he is.
Well, you have founded a whole chain of cities from Greece to India.
Indeed I have.
And you named this one Alexandria.
Uh-huh.
And you named this one Alexandria, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
Then there's Alexandria,
Yeah.
Alexandria,
Yeah.
and further east there's Alexandria.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's not forget Alexandria.
No. Well, that's
Okay.
the thing. I think it might be getting a bit confusing, don't you? Could we perhaps name this new one after someone else?
Okay. I am the greatest military commander that ever lived. I have conquered the known world, and I am barely 26 years old. Perhaps when you found your own city, you can name it after yourself. You could call it, Skinny Mandria. But since I'm founding them, I'd like to call it Alexandria. Okay.
Yes, sir.
No, actually, do you know what? Perhaps you're right. A great military ruler also listens to his advisors. It is getting a bit confusing. I think we should call it Iskandaran.
Iskandaran, great. Why Iskandaran?
It's Turkish.
Is it Turkish for Alexandria?
Yes.
Thought so.
Okay.
Anyways, it was Alexander's conquest and reconnection to the kingdom of Bactria, which is in Central Asia, present-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, and a little bit of Iran, that had a lot of Greek influence already, and it spearheaded more Greek influence all the way into the Indian subcontinent. And what that did was they started creating Buddha statues of Buddha the person. And before that, Buddhists never really represented the Buddha as a person, or as is usually depicted in non-human form with like pictures and drawings, kind of like Arabic calligraphy and whatnot. But now they started having a standing Buddha, a Buddha with a statue, and he's wearing kind of like a toga. And so there's a large connection of Greek and Indian art put together. And that's what really spreads this Western and some of the Greek culture coming about it. The philosophy of the Greeks starts spreading around to a lot. Now, that all happens in a relatively short time because in 150 years later, the Mediterranean's going to be a nasty zone of conflict. Rome was founded in 753 BC, and to them, it was used as a dating system, the Ab Urbe Condita. Though really the Romans didn't measure it that way. They measured it by their consuls, and then eventually the year they're in an emperor. Duh. What's worse is that I don't even care. That's trash. Call me. That's cool. Anyway, Rome had a slow rise in the beginning, controlling central Italy until further conflict had them moving southward around the 3rd century BCE. And it was only in conquest of southern Italy that Romans resisted the Greek colonies in Sicily. But the Roman military was far superior, and being recognized as that, the Greeks turned to one dude, and only one dude only, who could actively defeat the Romans to them. And his name was Pyrrhus. And the only reason I bring this guy up, because this is some funny stuff. I mean, it's awful because it's death and warfare, but like, hear me out. So he brought in war elephants, and he was a mercenary general for hire, and he could defeat the Romans. He had more troops, and he threw them at the Roman army. The problem was, because of the Roman efficiency in their system, they might have lost the battle and had to retreat, but Pyrrhus lost his entire army too, and it was called a Pyrrhic victory. And so you've seen that because it's idolized by that meme that you might have seen before. So that's a Pyrrhic victory. When you win the battle, but you lose the war because of it. While he may have won battles, he failed to win the war, and so Rome would eventually conquer southern Italy, and then eventually that puts them in contact with another empire in the Mediterranean that's also expanding. Almost all the wars of conquest that added territory to the Roman Republic, none were done out of Rome's choosing or aggression. They didn't just say, we want them, we're going in there. Never. Oh, sorry, there's like one or two examples. Like Caesar going into Gaul. He's like, I'm governor of Gaul, I'm going to take all of Gaul. And he takes all over modern France. Okay, that was 50 BC. However, Caesar's power from all of that and gains a lot of wealth, power. His eventual rise of power will make him quite holy. Get it? Oh, all right. Anyways, the benefit to Rome in all of that is that they learned to be pragmatic, learning to manage large amounts of territory from a city-state republic. That was until they grew too powerful for senator families to ignore, which led to infighting several. When the dust settled, Augustus Caesar was made emperor of an empire that stretched from the English Channel to the Nile River. He reorganized the empire and had imperial governors and senatorial governorships, and that's how Rome survived. They adapted as they came up with a new crisis. Some of those were not as good as others, but it let the empire continue and prosper. The Roman Empire will reach its peak in 150 CE, and it's called the Pax Romana, an era of peace within the Mediterranean, and it will last for about 200 years all around the Roman Mare Nostrum, which is Latin for our sea. And here's the thing, though. In 200 years, there were 51 emperors during this time. Some reigned for 17 years and others for 17 weeks. And all this time, what broke down the empire was not leadership, but stagnation. The empire was founded on slavery and plunder, and they ceased new campaigns that had any wealth brought in. Yeah, taking Babylon's going to make you some serious bank, but going into the Germanic tribes, you're going to find beer. And actually, the Romans hated beer. Of all people, they hated the Belgians the most. So all of this stuff that they wanted, without the plunder that they had, it led to a nasty trade deficit. Add that to the restless nomadic frontier tribes in the 4th and 5th centuries, a split of eastern and western halves and war administration, a change in religion, and the empire was relatively doomed. So in 476 Rome was sacked for the last time, and this time the entire Western Roman Empire with it. A few things about Rome that made it such a foundational empire for Europe. For one, it was incredibly patriarchal. Fathers had life and death control over their entire family and expected even married daughters their continued loyalty over their own husbands. So Rome didn't have a way for fathers to give up the rights and rule over their daughters because they had complete control. So the only way that someone could take rights of the woman over from the father was if the husband actually stole his betrothed girlfriend, the woman he wanted to marry. And what he did was he would literally steal her and take her away for a night. And the couple would come back to the dad and say, we should wed, or you can kill him, and I'm never getting married to anybody of noble birth. So that was the situation. And even then, the daughter was still supposed to be closely tied to the dad as well. So that's how little Rome thought of women in general. One other thing, though, about patriarchy and misogyny in general is that the Greeks and then the Romans after them believed that women were unformed men, that something happened in the womb that caused women to form instead of men, and women just didn't develop what men had, and that's it. So they were considered less than men, half men, or beneath men, but they were never considered any way, shape, or form relatively equal. And in fact, there was the Etruscans to the north of Rome, and they had pictures of like the men and women like together and buried together, and all kinds of things where the women and men were relatively equal. And the Romans just were like, what are you guys, what are you doing with her? Like, what? They just didn't get the Etruscans for being so equal in a sense, and then eventually conquered them, within a couple hundred years. So anyway, another example though is not only could fathers control their daughters, but they could also choose whether to acknowledge any child that was born at their first birthday. And at that point, they could name the child, which was pretty easy. You named your first sons, one thing or another, like, and then the sons after like third, you numbered them. Quintus, Sextus, Septimus, all of that stuff. The daughters, that was even easier. You just named them after yourself as the husband, as the dad, and you feminized the name. So, Kavina. Yeah. Ugh. The Roman aristocracy, the patricians, were considered royalty and were able to amass large sums of money. And if people couldn't pay their debts, they could enslave anyone else. And here's the thing. Taxes were based on a small percentage. So you need more people paying taxes because of the low percentages. If you took over people and enslaved them, that's one less person paying taxes. And that's eventually what would happen, is the tax base would actually weaken over time. And so as the empire expanded, they couldn't afford that expansion. And another way to get their wealth, plunder and enslaving conquered people, was relatively dried up by the 3rd century. There was no one left on their frontiers that they could effectively fight against and conquer. And so once again, they turned to a defensive strategy, which was based more on walls and defenses and forts, which were expensive to maintain. With low taxes, eventually costs are going to be way too high for what they're trying to do. So Western Roman Empire had considerably more costs and less revenue to maintain its northern and western frontiers, whereas the Eastern Empire had much more resources to deal with, but they also had powerful enemies to their flank. Now, one more factor remains, and this is equally important today. In around 165 CE, Roman soldiers began to fall ill in the eastern part of the empire in sieging a city on the Tigris River. And so what they found is they broke out in fever and small bumps and whatnot, and eventually it spread through the military and then to the entire empire. We believe this is most likely smallpox. It could have been measles. Regardless of what it was, is what it did was the big deal. This disease spread throughout the empire over the next 15 years and probably killed anywhere from 1/3 to 1/4 of all people in the Roman Empire. And not only that, though, is the total breakdown in society when that happens. Rome, for example, a population of maybe 1 million at the time, was losing 5,000 people per day. And not only did it wreck the military, but everybody else involved. And so you're talking about people that brought food, or ship hands managing boats, or gathering food and farming. Everybody was affected by this. And because of that, it broke down what could be brought to the cities, and it decreased the size of cities pretty quickly. And because of that, and the Roman Empire being such an urban empire, it weakened Rome, the empire as a whole, and it never recovered from this. So because of that, that's going to be one of the most crippling parts to all of the other factors. Even though Rome has 400 years more to go, 300 years more to go, it won't be anything. If they couldn't recover, it didn't matter. So this is the end of the classical era and what we've discussed. Now, I want to go over a few of these recaps of the videos we've just seen. First, in governance, the most important things to get out of this is the most successful states, Han, China, the Achaemenid, Persia, and Rome, were ruled by a head of state that was seen as divine. And whether they descended by gods, chosen by heaven, or the king of kings who were holy, they ruled with divine support. Religion and governance worked together for legitimacy. So we'll get more of that in a sec. They administered governance through communications and regional governors. They invested in infrastructure like road building to increase the speed of troops and the speed of communications. Still, remember, communication is a big deal in these time periods. It's really hard. I mean, you can see on this map how hard communication would have been getting anywhere. I mean, you send a message to Egypt and they'll get it, they'll get it in a month. So, other things, they adopted legal systems that set up fair rules for everyone, that everyone in society must abide by the laws of society. And that kept a lot more order, and they had magistrates to administer the law and interpret application of the law. Lastly, they had large bureaucracies of officials that could collect taxes efficiently and supply armies with logistics. All of those important for an empire to maintain itself. All right, so what happens next in European history after the fall of Rome? In short, the formation of feudal kingdoms with knights and nobles, eventually forming today's modern states. But that takes a long while. So the organization we will see of these states won't show up until around the 900s CE. So it takes four and a half centuries to get back into formed governance on the large scale that we look at. And that won't be till Charlemagne for the Franks and William the Conqueror for England. Now, feudalism is a government designed around a manor, and the manor system is where a noble owns large amounts of land, and he lets serfs who... I didn't even say anything. What? Anyways, okay. They had serfs, and the serfs were these peasants that could not leave the land. They were tied to the land, had to work the land, they got a little bit of pay and food, and that's about it. There were knights and men on retainer, so they were soldiers to the Lord, basically. Now, the object of the manor was self-sufficiency, and that meant that they produce all their own goods, and they have no need for trade and interaction. You made everything on your own manor, and you might trade a few things that you have in excess with the other manors around, but you kept it all pretty much self-sufficient. And you, as a noble, would be a vassal to a higher lord, and that lord might be a vassal to another lord who might be blah, 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 go up the chain, and then you have the king, who was like the first among all nobles. This isn't the king you think of when you think of the kings of the 17 and 1800s. The early kings, especially under feudalism, they were like the highest noble, and maybe more like Speaker of the House. They had the most power of all the other nobles, but the power wasn't as strong. So what did they do? They used the church to crown the king. And that way the church and the king would work together for legitimacy. Now, backing up a little bit, in Greece, the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, will still continue. And they never call themselves Byzantine. They call themselves Romans. And they're going to last till, spoilers alert, 1453 CE. Not that I have that memorized. Nope. All right. The Byzantine Empire would eventually try to reconquer a lot of the lost places in the Western Empire, particularly actually Rome and most of southern Italy, Sicily, North Africa, and all that. But it's too costly, and it's just becomes a big mess to maintain all these troops. Additionally, there's a warm winter in 549 CE. That allowed for rats carrying a disease to go further down the Nile. See, that going up the Nile is going south, like the Shenandoah, since the Nile and the Shenandoah both run northward. So, come on. It's relevant. It's relevant if you live in Virginia. Fine. Anyways, the disease in question was most likely the first instance of the bubonic plague, and it too devastated the Mediterranean, with about 1/4 of the population killed. One theme for this class as a whole, and why I bring this up, disease is an example of increased human connection. As the world gets more interconnected, periods of new developments, innovation, and growing pains. And I'm not making light of all this death and disease, but what it shows us is that the world is getting more connected. And so every period in human history where humans come in more contact with others over larger distances, disease enter virgin populations that are highly susceptible, that have never yet experienced these diseases. And that's why their mortality rate is so high. Nowadays, we're like, measles doesn't do anything to us. Yes, because most of us get the vaccine. And even then, we have most of us exposed to that vaccine. So we're okay. Now for the Catholic Church. None of this is any commentary on the Catholicism of today. So if any of this is seen as critical, it is not critical of the faith, but the practices of people back then. So there's my disclaimer. It's the same way I treated Islam without the details. And I'm not going to go into full treatment of Christianity because it's more well known in the United States. So we don't need to go into as much about the origins of Christianity. But the first major event I'm going to bring up in the scope of this was Constantine the Great converting on his deathbed. Now, his mother was a Christian, and Christianity was already gaining quite a lot of popularity, and it was seen then as a challenge to the emperor, since the emperor was supposed to be divine. So that's why it was persecuted so much, but it was also because one reason is that it was also critical of the opulent patrician lifestyle, and their sexual indulgences was a powerful way to protest against the rich. Much like our satire nowadays of making fun of people in power who are awful, that's kind of what religion or the Christianity in this was. And so to the plebeians in Rome and all around the empire, this was a criticism of Roman wealth, of Roman power, and their decadent lifestyle. And so mix this in with the people, and seeing all this, many people converted, and eventually when Constantine converted, the empire entirely went with it. Now, like most religions, when they find new places and find people, they try not to change it too much. And particularly the one thing that stuck and got close together with Christianity was the patriarchy of the Roman system, which further bound women into the roles of either nuns or wives. And that's it. And we'll talk maybe a little bit more later, but that's so anyway. Eventually, there were 5 cities that held patriarchs of the church, the heads of the church, and all of them fell to barbarians or Eastern armies, particularly by 700 BC. By 700 CE, only Constantinople and Rome were left. And over the next few hundred years, the 2 patriarchs, they became rivals and oversaw different rites, which I meant by practices of their faith. They sent out missionaries to bring more people under their right, and eventually a disagreement over idols. Whether Jesus Christ on the cross or a crucifix was considered idolatry and worshiping an idol, or a tool for teaching. The educated Eastern Church used flat, two-dimensional representations of Jesus and saints called icons, whereas in the West they saw as icons, and they saw the crucifix as idol worship. But in the West, with largely illiterate populace, the image of Jesus on the cross was much more powerful in helping convert and teach people about Christianity. This eventually led to a split in 1054 CE called the Great Schism. And just after, though, this would all change Europe once again. Now, more about this. The Western Church, the Catholic Church eventually, held immense power over feudal Europe. With the defeat of the Moors from Spain in 632 CE, the Battle of Tours, the victor, Charles Martel, will help create a Frankish kingdom culminating with the rise of his grandson, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne. What made Charlemagne become Holy Roman Emperor and crowned by the Pope was his assistance to Rome when they were threatened by a non-Christian army invading. And because of that, the Pope crowned him Emperor of Rome. What this does, though, and the broad ramifications of it, is it brought the Pope a lot of power as he appointed the kings. That he was God's messenger on earth, and he crowned kings at his will. And because of that, the kings listened to him. Otherwise, he could banish them from the church, or excommunicate them, is what it was called. And that would anger the people, obviously. So, not wanting to fall from God's grace, they looked once again to make sure they were good with the Pope. And in return, the Pope would prop up the king as the leader as well. This legitimacy, once again, as a major factor. What I mean by legitimacy is a right to rule. The mandate of heaven was a legitimacy thing. So is saying your emperor is God. And so all of these ways are ways to get the people to believe that this person belongs in power. Now, the last topic for this video is another result of the church and state authority coming together and combining. In the late 11th century, the Pope issued a command to retake the Holy Land after the Byzantine Empire lost control to the Muslims. The call to arms was met with at least 30,000 troops from Western Europe to go on the First Crusade. Now, this was not all of these knights errant and beautiful shining armor. These were dudes who basically had nothing better to do, aside from the kings and some of the nobles and stuff. But they basically cleared out all the people who were begging and the riffraff and jails and said, hey, look, do this and you get salvation. And so people are like, okay, cool. I have nothing better going on for me anyway. And so they went. And they marched all the way through Europe down to Constantinople, crossed there, and went through Anatolia. And on their way down, they run out of food. And so in many of their sieges, particularly in Antioch, they killed everything that was in the city. Because basically, if you were left in there, you were either what's called an apostate Christian, one who's not really a believing Christian anymore, you're a heathen. You either were that, or you just weren't Christian and you deserved to die anyway. And what they did with the vanquished dead is they would eat a lot of them because their food supplies ran out and they were under a lot of siege. And so as they marched down, destroying everything in their path, it did not leave a nice mark. And so from all of that, they got to Jerusalem in 1099 and conquered it, and killed everyone inside the city. Christian, Jew, Muslim alike, because once again, they issued orders. If you are a true believer and a real Christian, you won't be in that city defending against us. You will be joining us. And so this widespread killing, destroying, it left an impression. Even now, 900 years later, there's things we don't say. Like one example, because of this, the Red Cross is not the Red Cross in Muslim countries. It's the Red Crescent. And we try to use language that no longer has meanings so charged, like the word crusade.
And show no remorse. And this is a new kind of evil. And we understand. And the American people are beginning to understand. Now, this crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while.
So yeah, what the Crusades did do for Europe was bring back more technology and trade goods that were lost or unknown. The manner system of self-sufficiency took a hit in showing the weaknesses that they cannot produce everything everyone wanted. And so while the later Crusades eventually tried to kill one going again, there were 4 major ones and then some minor ones after. There was no children's crusade. That's a myth. However, they all failed anyway. A desire for Eastern goods, whether from China, from India, or the Middle East themselves, created new markets and desires, spurred trade, and eventually led to creating new thinking on how to get the riches of the East. I mean, it's like, let's say all of us are in a class and one kid brings in a DS and we're all like, dude, what is that? And it's like really awesome. And we're all like, oh my goodness, I want that too. How do we get those things? And now we're starting to plot how to get more of those things. So as you've watched these videos, think about what the whole point of all this information was. I'm not going to ask you about specific details, but you must have some detail in what you write when you go to write for this class. So what I mean by that is, remember some of the major ideas, and if you can find 1 or 2 details that was somewhat interesting, other than me boring and talking the whole time, my hint here is that think terms I've used: legitimacy, patriarchy, importance of trade and disease, organization, infrastructure, road building. Those are major things I brought up as ways empires sustain themselves, how they worked, what functioned, bureaucracy as well. And so those key statements all played into either state governments and control, trade, use of the environment. And those are going to be major themes throughout the year. And that's why I'm doing these videos, is to lay the groundwork for how the world was before we actually start into all that fun history stuff. So, thank you for watching and have a good one. Enjoy the dumb video.
I'm a crusader, sworn to win back Jerusalem from the Saracen Muslims, slaughtering them in the name of Christianity. It's hard, dirty work. That's why when I go on a crusade, I always bring along an old crone. She might just be an ugly old woman I kidnapped from my village, but old crone can wash out even the toughest of stains. We compared enslaving an old crone to not bothering to wash. And just look at the difference. Take old crone along with you on your crusade, and she'll comb those nits out of your hair. She'll even wash it too. Now if a Saracen cuts my head off, I know it'll look lovely. And that's not all. Old crone will even find food and cook it for you. And when there's a food shortage, old crone really comes into her own.
I found some grains of wheat in animal droppings, and the meat is the finest cut of enemy dead. The back side.
Old crone. You'll wonder how you ever survived on a crusade without one.
Warning, old crone is very old and may not even survive the journey. Always read the label.